$6 billion. That's what Russia can't afford to spend on the one thing keeping them in this war. Russia fires 10,000 artillery shells daily. They produce 5,000. The mathematics doesn't work. That deficit, 5,000 shells per day, costs $6 billion to close. But money isn't the problem. Industrial capacity is. Supply chains are. Time is. Russia can't buy its way out. Can't build its way fast enough. Can't smuggle its way around sanctions at scale. This is industrial warfare economics. And in the next 10 minutes, I'll show you exactly why Russia's artillery advantage is ending. Not from Ukrainian counter-battery fire, but from production mathematics they can't solve. The cost to produce. The time to build capacity. The economic constraints that no tactical brilliance can overcome. This is the strategic front. Let's break down the numbers. Here's what makes this crisis irreversible. Russia inherited 17 million artillery shells from Soviet stockpiles. That sounds like a lot. It is a lot. But here's the economic reality nobody calculated. Each shell costs roughly $800 to produce today. Sanctions, inflation, supply chain disruption, production costs tripled since Soviet times. 17 million shells at current prices? That's a $13 billion stockpile Russia inherited for free. They've fired 15 million of them. At peak intensity in 2022, Russia was burning through $16 million in ammunition. Every single day, 16 million. Daily. That's not sustainable for any economy. Not even Russia's. But it was possible because they weren't producing those shells. They were consuming a stockpile built over 40 years. Now that stockpile is functionally depleted, and Russia faces a problem no Soviet inheritance can solve. They have to produce what they're consuming. In real time. At current costs. Here's where the mathematics becomes brutal. Russia currently produces around 5,000 shells per day, based on production facility capacity analysis and OSINT tracking of Russian defense plants. That's $4 million in daily production. They're firing 10,000 shells daily. $8 million. In consumption, the gap? $4 million. Every day? That's $1.4 billion per year Russia is burning through reserves they no longer have. And closing that gap, doubling production to 10,000 shells daily, requires $6 billion in capital investment. New factories, new equipment, new supply chains. Construction time? 18 to 24 months. Minimum. Russia doesn't have 18 months. They don't have $6 billion to invest without cutting other military programs. And even if they did both, the economics still don't work. Because those new factories need components. Precision machinery, quality steel, electronics for fuses, all of which face Western sanctions or require smuggling at markup prices. This is why Russia is buying 1 million shells from North Korea. Why are they negotiating with Iran? Why are they trying to restart Cold War-era production lines in Belarus? Not because these sources are ideal. Because Russian domestic production can't close a $4 million daily gap. The mathematics are unforgiving. So why can't Russia just build more factories? $6 billion. Problem solved? Not even close. Because artillery shell production isn't about money alone. It's about components Russia can no longer source. Let me show you where it breaks down. Every artillery shell needs 4 things. Steel casing. Russia produces this domestically. Maximum capacity, 6,000 shells daily. That's the physical ceiling. And it hasn't moved in 3 years. Propellant and explosives. Specialized chemicals Russia can make. But production equipment? Much of it came from Western manufacturers. Sanctioned. Replacement cost? Triple. Fuses. This is the killer. Modern fuses need electronics. Semiconductors. Timing chips. Russia imported 80% of these components pre-war. Now, smuggled at 400% markup. Cost per shell with domestic production? $800, derived from material costs, labor rates, and documented Russian defense procurement data. Cost per shell using smuggled components? $1,200 minimum. That 50% markup applies to every shell Russia produces going forward. The economics just got worse. Now let's talk about what $6 billion actually buys you. New factories and equipment for $1 billion. Supply chain infrastructure for sanctioned components, $2 billion. Timeline to operational, 24 months. Result? Production doubles from 5,000 to 10,000 shells. Daily. But here's the trap. That matches current consumption. Russia spends $6 billion in 2 years just to break even. No stockpile rebuild. No strategic reserve, just maintaining the status quo. To actually get ahead, to build reserves for future offensives, Russia needs 15,000 shells daily. That's another $4 billion. Another 2 years. At this rate, rebuilding pre-war stockpiles takes a decade. If this analysis is helping you understand the economics behind the headlines, hit subscribe. We break down the mathematics of modern warfare every single day. Now the final piece that makes this unsolvable. Russia's defense budget, $85 billion annually. Cost of current Ukraine operations, $60 to $80 billion per year. What's left for everything else, including long-term industrial investment? Maybe $5 to $25 billion. That has to cover all weapons systems. Tanks, missiles, aircraft, navy, air defense, everything. So when Russia needs $6 billion for shell production, that money comes from other weapons programs. Which means solving the artillery problem creates problems everywhere else. This isn't a production challenge. It's an economic equation with no good solution. Every dollar fixing shells is a dollar not spent on missiles. Every billion invested in factories is a billion cut from modernization. Russia can't afford to fix this. And they can't afford not to. That's the trap. And it explains what happens next. So what does a $6 billion gap actually mean on the battlefield? It means Russia is fighting a different war than the one they planned. And that change has a price tag. Early 2022, Russia fired 20,000 shells daily. Cost, $16 million per day from stockpiles they weren't replacing. That was economically viable for maybe 6 months. Russia bet the war would be over by then. Late 2025, Russia fires 10,000 shells daily. Cost, $8 million per day, but now they're producing only $4 million in domestic capacity. The $4 million daily gap is being filled by North Korean shells at $1,200 each. That's a 50% markup on 4,000 shells daily. Russia is paying $2 million extra every day just to maintain half their 2022 fire rate. Do that math annually. $730 million in markup costs, just for artillery, just to stay at half capacity. But the economics get worse when Russia tries to adapt. Remember those Ukrainian strikes on ammunition depots? Donetsk, Tver, Toropets. Russia's response: disperse ammunition storage. Spread shells across dozens of smaller sites instead of central warehouses. Sounds smart tactically. Economically, disaster. Concentrated storage. One security perimeter, one logistics hub, efficient distribution. Cost to protect and operate? Estimate $50 million per major depot annually. Dispersed storage across 10 sites. 10 security perimeters. 10 logistics hubs. Fragmented distribution. Cost: roughly $200 million annually. That's $150 million in additional costs per year, just to protect ammunition from strikes. Ukraine forced Russia to spend an extra $150 million annually through 10 successful depot strikes. That's a $15 million average cost per strike. To impose $150 million in permanent costs. 10-to-1 economic return. And it compounds every year Russia maintains dispersed operations. This is economic warfare through logistics interdiction. And it's working. Every adaptation Russia makes to ammunition constraints costs money. They don't have other priorities. Dispersed storage? That's $150 million not spent on. Tank production. North Korean shells at markup? That's $730 million. Not spent on missile stockpiles. Reduced artillery fire? That means more infantry casualties, which means more compensation payments, more medical costs, more recruitment incentives to replace losses. The shell shortage doesn't just limit Russian firepower. It creates cascading economic costs across the entire war effort. And every dollar spent managing the artillery crisis is a dollar that can't fix the missile crisis, or the drone crisis, or the next crisis. This is the economic trap Russia can't escape. Not with $6 billion. Not with current production capacity. Not in the time frame that matters for this war. Here's what this means. Russia can't win an artillery war they can't afford to sustain. And they can't afford to sustain it because the economics broke before the tactics did. Remember that $6 billion gap we opened with? It doesn't solve a problem when the problem is time, supply chains, and industrial capacity Russia no longer controls. This is the reality of modern warfare. Whoever understands economics has an advantage firepower alone can't overcome. Ukraine figured that out. Russia is learning it the expensive way. If this breakdown helped you see past the headlines into the mathematics that actually decide wars, subscribe. We analyze operations like this through economics every day. Tomorrow, Russia's T-14 Armada tank, $5 billion invested, 0 combat deployments. The economics of failure. Subscribe for tomorrow's breakdown. This is the strategic front.